On October 15th, 1970, the city of Melbourne felt an earthquake, or at least that's what it felt like. Windows rattled in suburbs 5 kilometres away. A plume of dust rose into the air that could be seen from the city skyline. But it wasn't the earth moving. It was 2,000 tonnes of steel crashing into the Yarra mud. In a matter of seconds, 35 men were gone. Fathers, brothers, sons, migrants who had come to Australia to build a new life, and locals who were just doing a day's work. They were riggers, boilermakers, engineers, and first aid officers. 1 minute, they were eating their lunch in the huts below, or tightening bolts on the span above. The next minute, the world turned upside down. This is not just a story about a bridge. It is a story about hubris, about a design that was flawed from the start, about warnings that were ignored, and about the deadliest industrial disaster in Australian history. Join me as we go back to that grey October morning, to the moment the bolts started to turn blue, to the moment the bridge groaned, and to the moment the silence fell. Warning, this video contains descriptions of a catastrophic accident that some viewers may find distressing. To understand the tragedy, we have to understand the dream. In the late 1960s, Melbourne was a divided city. The Yarra River split the western suburbs from the city centre. If you wanted to get from Geelong to the city, you had to take the Williamstown ferry or drive the long way around. The Westgate Bridge was going to change everything. It was a monster of a project, a cable-stayed box girder bridge. It was modern. It was sleek. It was supposed to be the gateway to a new, booming Melbourne. But from the very beginning, the project was cursed. It was plagued by strikes, by bad weather, by arguments between the designers in London and the builders on the ground. The design itself was complex. It relied on box girders, huge hollow tunnels of steel that were bolted together to form the span. But unlike other bridges, these girders were made of a specifically unusual type of steel, and the margins for error were terrifyingly small. By 1970, the project was running 2 years behind schedule. The pressure to finish was immense. The engineers were stressed. The workers were continually stopping work over safety concerns. They called it the Rusty Humpy. They joked that it moved in the wind. But the joke stopped being funny on the morning of October 15th. The problem was span 10 to 11. This was a huge section of the bridge on the western side. When the two halves of the span were brought together to be joined, they didn't fit. There was a camber, a difference in height, of about 114 millimetres. The north side was higher than the south side. Imagine trying to zip up a jacket where one side is higher than the other. It doesn't work. So the engineers made a fatal decision. They decided to use 8 8-ton concrete blocks to weigh down the high side. They thought the weight would push the steel down, align the two halves, and allow them to bolt it together. It worked, sort of. The gap closed, but the force of that weight caused the steel to buckle. The upper plate of the bridge, the part cars drive on, bulged upwards. It looked like a corrugation. On the morning of October 15th, the head engineer, Jack Hinshaw, made another decision. To fix the buckle, they would unbolt some of the screws on the transverse splice, the join running across the bridge. The idea was to release the tension, let the steel settle, and then rebolt it. It was a theory. In practice, it was like undoing the lid of a pressure cooker while it's still on the stove. The time, 11:30 a.m. The morning shift were working. Down on the ground, in the site huts directly underneath the bridge, the men were breaking for lunch. They were eating sandwiches, playing cards, changing into their overalls. Up on the bridge, the riggers started to undo the bolts. They undid one, then another, then another. Around 11:40 a.m., things started to get weird. The bridge began to make noises. Workers described it as a pinging sound, like a rifle shot. Ping, ping, ping. It was the sound of steel yielding. Frank Piermarini, a rigger, was inside the box girder. He was standing inside the hollow tunnel of the bridge. He felt the floor beneath him shift. He looked at the steel walls. They were changing colour. The grey paint was flaking off, revealing blue steel underneath. The metal was stretching, screaming under the load. 11:50 a.m. The groan turned into a roar. The unbolted seam couldn't hold the weight. The buckle snapped. The entire 112-metre span, 2,000 tonnes of steel, lost its structural integrity. It didn't just fall, it folded. One survivor said it looked like a giant pair of scissors closing. It took roughly 10 seconds for the span to hit the ground. For the men on top, there was no time to think. Des Gibson was working on his knees. He felt the bridge split open, like an earthquake. He fell into the hollow darkness of the girder as it plummeted. He described bouncing around like a rubber ball inside the crashing steel. Ed Halsall was on the ground. He looked up and saw the sky falling. He ran. The air displacement from the falling bridge was so massive it created a shockwave, a blast of wind that hit with the force of a hurricane. Ed was lifted off his feet and thrown 10 metres into the mud. That blast of wind likely saved his life, pushing him out of the kill zone. The impact shook Melbourne. The sound was heard 20 kilometres away. A cloud of dust, mud and diesel fumes rose 100 metres into the air. Then silence. For a few seconds, there was absolute ringing silence. Then the screaming started, and the siren. The scene on the ground was apocalyptic. The site huts, where the men had been eating lunch, were gone, flattened instantly by 2,000 tons of metal. Diesel fuel from the cranes laughed a huge fire. The mud of the Yarra bank turned into a quagmire of oil, water, and debris. The rescue effort began immediately, but it was chaotic. Construction workers tore at the twisted steel with their bare hands. They used oxy-torches to try and cut through the wreckage, desperate to reach the voices screaming from underneath. Peter Crossley, a doctor who rushed to the scene, later said it was like a battlefield. He had to crawl into the twisted wreckage to administer morphine to men who were trapped, men who he knew he couldn't save. He had to make the impossible decisions of who to treat and who to leave. Frank Piermarini, the man inside the girder, miraculously, he was alive. He was pulled from the wreckage covered in oil, with severe injuries, but he survived the fall. Des Gibson also survived his tumble inside the steel beast. He crawled out with bruises but no broken bones, though the trauma would haunt him for the rest of his short life. But for 35 men, there was no miracle. Some died instantly from the impact, some drowned in the mud, some were crushed. The roll call of the dead is a snapshot of 1970s Australia. Barbuto, Butters, Carpenter, Grist, Upstell, West, a mix of Aussies, Brits, Italians, Yugoslavs. Jack Hinshaw, the engineer who ordered the bolts to be removed, died with his men. He rode the bridge down. The rescue operation lasted for days. The fires burned into the night. The city of Melbourne went into collective shock. Flags flew at half-mast. The newspapers were filled with black borders. Westgate disaster, screamed the headlines, but grief quickly turned to anger. How could a modern bridge just fall down? A royal commission was set up instantly. It took months. It heard from 52 witnesses. It produced a report that was 8,000 pages long. The verdict was damning. It found that the disaster wasn't an act of God. It was a failure of men. It blamed the designers, Freeman Fox and Partners, for a failure of calculation. They hadn't done the maths properly on the safety margins. It blamed the builders for their chaotic site management. And it blamed the culture of the project, the timeline pressure, the refusal to listen to the workers, the arrogance of the engineers who thought they could defy the laws of physics. The report famously stated, the disaster was unnecessary. It was the result of a failure of organisation and communication. Basically, nobody was talking to anyone else. The designers didn't talk to the builders. The engineers didn't listen to the riggers. The Westgate Bridge sat there, broken for years. A scar on the skyline. It wasn't finished until 1978, 8 years after the collapse. When it finally opened, there was no party, no champagne, no ribbon cutting. It was a sombre affair. The first cars drove across a bridge that was essentially a tombstone. Today, if you drive over the Westgate Bridge, you are driving over the scene of a crime. You probably curse the traffic. You look at the view of the city, but if you look down, near the base of Pillar 10, you will see a small park. There is a plaque there, and 35 pillars, one for each man. Every year, on October 15th, at 11:50 a.m., the traffic stops. The survivors, the widows, and the children gather. They hold a minute's silence. The Westgate collapse changed Australia. It didn't just change engineering standards, though it did do that. It changed the way we treat workers. It birthed the modern occupational health and safety laws. Before Westgate, a worker dying on site was considered part of the job. After Westgate, it became unacceptable. The union swore, never again. And that phrase became the bedrock of Australian construction safety. So the next time you cross that bridge, high above the Yarra, spare a thought for the 35 men who paid for it. They went to work on a Thursday morning to build a gateway to the future, and they never came home. If stories of Australian history, both the funny and the tragic, are what you want to hear, hitting that subscribe button is the best way to support the channel. We will see you in the next one. Drive safe.